All right, guys, let's examine the other cause of economic fluctuations, aggregate supply. All right, so here we are. Here we are at the natural level of output. We're at full employment. All right, so this, if you ever see a test question, the test question will often say, assume the economy begins in long-run equilibrium. That, ladies and gentlemen, is long-run equilibrium. Suppose firms experience an increase in the cost of production. What is the economic impact of such a phenomenon? All right, so what kind of events would increase the cost of production for firms? Well, it could be something like an increase in taxes, increase in minimum wages. We might say maybe it's oil prices have gone way up, or some natural resources have gone way up. Maybe they're in short supply. So anyways, when we do have an increase in the cost of production, is that going to shift the aggregate supply curve or the aggregate demand curve? Remember, the aggregate demand curve, we're talking about the components of GDP. Now we're talking about production and the cost of production. So that's going to shift the aggregate supply curve. And then, so what direction would the shift be? Well, as a result of this, what you have to ask yourself is, is this going to become more profitable for businesses or less profitable for businesses? Less profitable. So are businesses going to be willing to supply as much, or are they going to supply less? They're going to supply less. It's become less profitable to supply, so they will supply less. So anyways, we will see an aggregate supply curve that will shift to the left. All right, so here we were. Let's doing step 3 here. Here we were at point A, producing at full employment at the natural rate of output, and then all of a sudden there was a shift to the left, and all of a sudden we are not producing at full employment anymore. We are producing less than that. Is that called an expansionary gap or a recessionary gap? Recessionary gap. We are not producing at full capacity. This also can occur with a shift in aggregate demand. Do you remember? But when we talked about aggregate demand, when aggregate demand shifted, we saw a decrease in the price level. How about here? When the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, we're producing less. That's actually going to increase the price level. We have less goods out there, so we're going to be competing. All the same number of people are going to be competing for a smaller number of goods. So the price level is going to go up, PL2. Quite different from the shift in aggregate demand. This is called stagflation. This is a term you have to understand. It will be on the test. What is stagflation? Well, stagflation is a situation where you have a shift in the aggregate supply which causes an increase in the price level, causes inflation, as well as it causes businesses to produce less goods and services. So here we are producing at point B. Is that going to stay that way in the long run? No. What's going to happen? Prices have gone up. Does that mean that wages will eventually go up? We'll have clear ideas about perceptions of relative prices. The economy will adjust in the long run, and the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And so what's going to happen is we'll get up to point C right here. So we will even see a larger amount of inflation, but we will eventually get back to full employment. Even though governments and the Bank of Canada has done nothing to interfere in the market here, eventually wages will adjust, prices will adjust, perceptions will adjust, and our economy will eventually get to full employment again. That could take a long time though, right? 5, 6, 7, 10 years. It's happened before. Stagflation, remember that. Here's another example, but this time suppose an earthquake occurs in China. What we are seeing right now, what I want you to look at, this is the long run equilibrium here for the economy in Canada. But now there's an earthquake in China. And so basically that's affecting supply chains of Canadian companies. It's getting harder for them to get component parts and processors. And so it's getting harder to find these component parts. And so the price of them are obviously going to go up. Is that going to affect aggregate demand or aggregate supply? Aggregate supply, it's going to be harder to produce goods and services. What direction is the shift? These products are going to become more expensive, just like last time. Now here we are from A to B. Are we going to have an expansionary gap or an inflationary gap? I made a mistake when I said that. Remember, an expansionary gap and inflationary gap mean the same thing. Sorry, I'm confusing you, aren't I? Is this an expansionary gap or a recessionary gap? Recessionary gap. Are we going to be paying more? Is that going to cause inflation? Sure is. And what's going to happen in the future? Well, the economy is going to adjust. And the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. And what we are going to see now is even a greater level of prices. And we're going to see the quantity go back to full employment despite no intervention by governments or the Bank of Canada. All right, so I just wanted to pull up these two things right now. If we have an adverse shift in aggregate demand, which is on the left, right? That's loss of consumer confidence. Stock market goes down. Threats of tax increases in the future, perhaps. What are we going to see? We're going to see a recessionary gap. But price levels go down. How about in the case of stagflation? Aggregate supply shifts to the left. We go from A to B, absolutely, and we have a recessionary gap. But in this case, we see price levels go up. We have inflation. Now, just as a little hint to the next chapter. I mean, obviously, when there's an adverse, just going back to the slide here on the left, obviously, see, the Bank of Canada and the government, they have control over only one of these curves. The aggregate demand curve. That's what they really have control over. You remember what aggregate demand is? Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Well, notice that G. Governments can always spend a lot more money. And then the Bank of Canada also can stimulate consumption and investment by lowering interest rates and printing money. So they have, and also affecting the exchange rate. So they have an effect on aggregate demand. But aggregate supply, you can argue that they have some effect. I mean, they do educate people. They can provide free education. You know, long-term, those are sort of long-run factors. Like that, so I would argue that they do in the long run have an effect on the long run aggregate supply curve. Yeah, I know that. But in the short term, when there's a fluctuation and that fluctuation needs to be corrected, what they have power is to shift the aggregate demand curve. So on the graph on the left here, which is the topic of the next chapter here, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Stock market goes down, lots of less confidence. The Bank of Canada can print money. The Canadian government can say we're going to support businesses. They can do government spending. They can shift that aggregate demand curve back to where it was. If they can't wait for it to fix on its own, they can step in and move that aggregate demand curve. They'll probably take on more government debt. I'm not saying there's no consequences, but they can affect the aggregate demand curve and shift it to the right. What about on the case on the right? Well, in the case on the right, when you have stagflation, They can't move the AS curve back. But what if they influence the aggregate demand curve? They can. Would that help? Well, what we see here is the aggregate supply curve, with the aggregate supply situation here, the stagflation, they can shift the aggregate demand curve to the right and therefore more quickly bring the economy back into long-run equilibrium. They can make that happen faster than waiting the 5, 7, 10 years for the economy to correct itself by boosting C, boosting I, boosting G, and X. But you'll notice that it's only at the cost of inflation. Yes, we will get back to we'll get back to full employment. And that's why they do it, by the way. We want to make sure everybody's working, that the economy is working at its capacity, that the economy is working at full employment. Absolutely, that's important. But the only way to fix stagflation is to change the aggregate demand curve, to shift it to the right, and that means even greater inflation. All right, so to sum up, there are two important lessons here. Shifts in aggregate supply can cause stagflation, and that's a combination of a recessionary gap, falling output, and also rising prices. Policymakers who can influence aggregate demand can potentially mitigate the adverse impact on output, but only at the cost of exacerbating the problem of inflation.